Take a personality exam online, any of them, and at some point it asks you, do you gain energy from being with people, or do you prefer your own company? And you sit there gazing at the computer because the honest answer is actually both. It depends. It depends on the day, on the people, on whether you slept well, on how much you've had to perform previously that week, on whether the gathering is 20 people making small chat or 4 people having a meaningful conversation. You want to select a box and move on, but neither box quite fits. So you pick the one that feels slightly more accurate and then spend the remainder of the quiz second-guessing yourself. If it sounds familiar, welcome. You could be what psychologists call an ambivert, and the psychology underlying it is far more intriguing than a personality type that merely means somewhere in the middle. Let's start with the framework that created introvert and extrovert household phrases, because it's crucial to understand where ambiverts belong inside it. Carl Jung created the introvert-extrovert divide in the early 20th century, and the core notion was about where a person concentrates their psychological energy: inward toward the inner world of thoughts and reflection, or outward toward the exterior world of people and activities. Over the following century, the conceptual distinction became one of the most researched dimensions in personality psychology, eventually constituting the E in the Big Five personality model, one of the most scientifically proven frameworks in the discipline. But here's what the mainstream version of this framework silently left out. Jung himself never characterized introversion and extroversion as separate characteristics. He defined them as extremes of a spectrum. And around the middle of that range, which is where most humans really land, is an area that doesn't have a tidy tail tied to it. No dramatic, I recharge alone storyline. No, I come alive in crowds identity. Just both, depending, occasionally, it fluctuates. That intermediate region is where ambiverts dwell. And study reveals it's less of a personality exception and more of a statistical norm. A research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology indicated that the majority of persons score closer to the midpoint of the introversion-extroversion scale than to either extreme. Not a marginal minority, the majority. The dramatic introvert and the conventional extrovert are essentially the outliers. The ambivert is closer to the human default. So what's truly going on in the brain of an ambivert? Because this isn't just about social preference, it goes neurological. One of the more persuasive ideas in personality neurology, proposed by Eysenck, suggests that introverts and extroverts differ in their baseline levels of cerebral arousal. Introverts have inherently higher baseline arousal. Their nervous system is already working at a higher activation level, which means stimulating social circumstances push them toward overload quicker. Extroverts have lower baseline arousal and seek exciting surroundings to get themselves up to an ideal level. The social energy they acquire from parties and crowds isn't figurative. It's an actual calibrating mechanism. Ambiverts, in this view, reside in the arousal sweet spot. Their baseline is modest, not consistently understimulated like an extrovert's baseline, not persistently near overload like an introvert's. This means their ideal stimulation level is varied. Sometimes a noisy dinner party strikes precisely right, and sometimes the same loud dinner party is actually depleted, depending on what their nervous system has previously been processing that day. It's not inconsistency. It's sensitive to context. Their nervous system is reading the circumstance and adapting, rather than having a set response to social information. This makes ambiverts actually tougher to identify, but it also makes them, in some settings, highly adaptable. A remarkable piece of study published in the journal Psychological Science put this flexibility to the test. The study looked at sales success among a sample of persons who had been tested on the introversion-extroversion scale. The traditional idea was that extroverts would prevail. They're outgoing, they converse readily, they're comfortable with strangers. And extroverts did perform well. but they didn't perform best. The top performers were the ambiverts. The researchers said this was because ambiverts can read a social situation flexibly, understanding when to push forward and when to pull back, when to talk and when to listen, when to be warm and open, and when to give someone space. They don't have a fixed social gear. They have a range. Think about what that actually looks like in practice. An ambivert in a networking event may work the room when they need to, have the enthusiastic, charming presence of someone who adores people, and then excuse themselves, find a quiet corner, recharge for 20 minutes, and come back. They can migrate between modes. The introvert typically can't sustain the first mode long enough. The extrovert generally doesn't feel the need for the second. The ambivert accomplishes both, not as adjustment, but as natural rhythm. But here's where things gets a bit philosophically tricky, and it's worth being honest about it. The phrase ambivert occasionally gets employed as an escape hatch from self-knowledge rather than a tool for it. If someone characterizes themselves as an ambivert solely because they don't want to commit to an answer, because introverts appear antisocial and extroverts seem superficial, and ambivert seems neatly balanced, that's not genuine personality insight. That's aesthetic predilection for a certain label. Real ambivert experience has a distinct feel to it. It involves true tension. The yearning to go to the party and the equal longing to stay home, both coming at the same moment. The ability to be genuinely, really present in a discussion, and then to require, with equal truthfulness, to be entirely alone thereafter. The social performance that is actually delightful, not contrived, and the tiredness that follows it, likewise genuine, not staged. If you felt both sides of that, not one occasionally and one primarily, but both with actual power, you're probably not hedging. You're describing something actual. And the data supports the concept that this experience has a distinct cognitive texture too. Ambiverts tend to score higher on assessments of self-monitoring, the capacity to read a room and alter behavior accordingly. They're typically intensely aware of the social dynamics around them, of who needs what, of when the vibe in a room is altering. This isn't social anxiety, though it might be misconstrued as such from the outside. It's attunement, a highly calibrated sensitivity to social context that the strongly introverted and strongly extroverted don't necessarily acquire to the same degree, precisely because their response to social settings is less dependent. There's something profoundly freeing about understanding yourself via this lens, assuming the lens fits. For a long time, ambiverts who sought to identify themselves in the introvert-extrovert dichotomy felt a kind of low-level wrongness, the sensation that they were failing at being one thing or the other. Too sociable to be a true introvert, nor social enough to be a real extrovert. Needing to explain themselves in places where everyone seemed to have a straightforward response. But the binary was always a simplification. It was a handy tool that was viewed as an accurate map, and like any simplified maps of difficult land, it left a lot of people standing in a spot the map didn't have a name for. The true psychological landscape looks more like a bell curve, with the dramatic poles at each extreme and the huge, diversified middle inhabited by most of us. And the medium isn't a compromise between two extremes. It's its own thing, with its own rhythms, its own strengths, its own special type of wisdom about people and circumstances, and when to lean in and when to step back. If you're someone who has spent years feeling like you don't quite match either category, who chooses extrovert or introvert on a quiz and then instantly feels a little internal asterisk appearing, I'd give you this. The category that suits you best could not be the one at either pole. It may be the one that depicts a person who can fully embody both, who pays attentive attention to context, and who has established a calm sophistication about social situations precisely because such circumstances have never been routine or straightforward. That's not a personality type you choose for the aesthetic. That's something earned. So, whose side of the spectrum do you reside on? Or are you somewhere in that tricky, intriguing middle? Drop it in the comments. I'm truly wondering where you land and how it actually shows up in your life. And if getting this deep into the psychology of how you're wired seems like your thing, there's a lot more where this came from.